Okay, so today we are going to explore grief, and especially this quiet collective grief that many of us may be feeling right now. And in earlier videos, in earlier videos, I shared about anger and about fear. And now we're going to look at grief. And part of this is just kind of the craziness that's happening in our world today. As I film this video, it's February of 2026, and we've just got a lot going on in the world today. And so I wanted to share with you some journaling. First, I'm going to share some journaling that I did this morning around the topic of grief. I'll just read what I shared in my journal. Okay, here we go. Today, I'm exhausted. I'm physically and emotionally exhausted. It's cloudy outside and I'm solar powered, so that always makes everything harder for me. And then in my journaling, I went on to list many things that I'm worried about, things with my family, with friends, with my work, and just with the general craziness, violence that's happening in our world today. And then I wrote this, and this is the crux of developing a new relationship with grief and sadness. Typically, I rush toward solutions, but today I will sit with the sadness. Sadness and grief are not the enemy. They simply are. They don't need to be shamed or rushed or bypassed. They need to be felt. Grief is visiting me today, but it's not moving in with me. I will try and be a good host to the sadness, knowing that there is also goodness there. Maybe my guest, sadness, has brought me a gift that will enrich my life. Or maybe it's here just for a moment in time. And if my guest overstays their welcome, I will let them know. I will also know that this is not a one-time visit. Sadness will return, and that's okay. I can have a relationship with grief without letting it take over my life, take over and run my life. I am stronger than that. I can accept the feeling of grief, sit with it, and also place boundaries on it. This is the structure of any good relationship. So grief, you are welcome here today. I will share with you, I will listen to you, and I will learn from you. And then I will let you go until next time. So that's the journaling that I did today. And, I fully recognize that everyone's grief is different. And I don't mean to say this is how you need to handle your grief. But maybe this can be a framework that you can use to just look at grief differently. And if we look at it differently, and again, I think it really is important to not push it away, to not bypass it, to not judge ourselves for feeling grief, but to sit with it, to see what kind of a relationship we can have with grief. So I hope sharing that journaling that I did this morning can help you too. Okay, so now we're going to get a little more into grief. Just some things, the ways that we can work with it. Again, kind of following that pattern of developing a different relationship with grief, but also recognizing things that aren't sort of these big G griefs, but are little g griefs, if that makes sense. Quiet griefs that maybe we don't always recognize. And I'm trying a new format, doing this on PowerPoint. My first career was as an educator. I have a master's degree in education. And so this format just feels very comfortable to me because I've been doing presentations my entire adult career. So, and if I haven't introduced myself yet, or if you haven't been to this channel, I'm Kathy Weens. I'm a licensed professional counselor and trauma recovery coach. And this channel is dedicated to helping women like me over the age of 50 or 60 to overcome past traumas and to really figure out what's right with us, to stop looking at things that are wrong with us, but to figure out what is good about us and how do we want to continue in this last few chapters of our life. All right, so we'll get get into this video about grief. Okay, so grief, the silent grief that so many people are carrying right now, that's what we're going to talk about today. And learning to hold sadness without letting it overtake us. And this connects with a previous video that I did that talked about anger and talked about anger being a loud cousin to grief. And so today we're going to slow down and we're going to look directly at grief itself. Okay, so many people are carrying grief today, and it's a heaviness. It's a heaviness sometimes that's hard to name. It's not, like I said earlier, it's not always a death or a big catastrophe, some kind of natural event like a hurricane or tornado or a house burning down. Like I said, a loved one dying. We can often recognize grief and sadness with those events, but oftentimes we have grief and sadness over other things in our life that maybe people don't see and maybe we don't fully recognize. And that's sort of this quiet grief that we carry. It's a heaviness that's hard to name, and it's not always dramatic or obvious, but it can be quietly present. And in conversations that I have with my coaching clients and in friendships, and even personally, people may describe this subtle emotional weight that they're feeling. So life can look extremely good on the outside, but inside something may just feel unsettled. And maybe we can't even name it ourselves. And in the world today, it's not that we're always carrying just personal grief. There's collective grief. Like I said, there's a lot of stuff going on in our world today. So things like shifts in the world, changes that are happening, changes in our community, and loss of certainty or safety. And, we can feel that today with kind of a lot of political craziness that's happening. And so that can be a form of collective grief. But again, if it's not a big thing that's happening, we may not recognize it as grief. So it can be that subtle, quiet grief. And your grief makes sense. You don't have to justify it, okay? So that's a lot of what we're going to talk about, to recognize that quiet grief. Grief doesn't require permission or comparison. Grief just requires acknowledgement without shame, okay? Reducing that shame and just acknowledging or noticing. That's what we can do with that grief, especially the quiet or silent grief. And psychologists call this ambiguous grief or ambiguous loss, when there's no clear ending or no clear resolution. And so grief can mean a response to a meaningful loss. And again, like I said earlier, that's not just a death or a tragedy, but it's nevertheless a meaningful loss in our life. And there can be ongoing losses. That's what makes it ambiguous, because there's no like beginning and end. It just kind of continues. And there can be undefined losses. And so that's why it's important to stop and notice and think about what we're actually feeling to see if we can understand what that loss is. And then again, changes without closure. As human beings, we need closure in our lives. And sometimes with, some of these quiet griefs, we don't have that. Griefs, is that how you say that word? Grievances? Not really. Griefs. Anyway. Okay, so some examples of collective grief that we may be feeling today are safety in the world. Maybe there's uncertainty about the future. Maybe we have lost trust in our relationships or in institutions. Maybe we are grieving the loss of connection and belonging. Maybe we've lost something in our community. Maybe we've lost friendships or family relationships. And maybe we're just grieving simplicity that we once had. If our life is in transition and it's changing, maybe we just wish and we're grieving for that simpler, quieter time we had in our life. And sometimes this quiet grief can feel like fatigue, irritability, loss of motivation, subtle sadness. and or emotional flatness. And again, this quiet grief, it can be hard to articulate it, but we need to pay attention to it because it has a powerful impact in our life. And when we feel some of these things, this fatigue or irritability, then we can stop and pause and think, what's going on in me? Is there something I'm grieving? And figure that out. And then some additional factors, and this is especially true for women like me over the age of 50 or 60, there can be additional factors. So maybe there's cultural or social shifts. Oftentimes women in my age group, we start feeling invisible to the world. And so, where one time we had a lot of, I'll say, power, a lot of influence in the world, we don't have that as much. Maybe we've retired, so we don't have that job. So that's kind of a cultural or a social shift. And there may be others that you can think of. Aging and health changes, again, that really impacts us as we get older. We can't do as much. Maybe our health is declining. Even though we try and do all the right things, our health can still decline. There are family transitions, and that's true in any stage in life. And there's part of that is grief. So if we think about, a young couple that has their first child, that can be a wonderful thing. But they can also grieve the fact that we're no longer just a couple. Now we're a family. And so there's some grief in that, along with the joy. For me, I feel grief over the fact that, at one time I was that young woman with children, and we were all one nuclear family. The four of us were a nuclear family. Well, now we're still a family, but my children are grown and they have families and lives of their own. And so the reality is we are sort of three families, even though we're still the same family. My daughter has a family, my other daughter has her family, and my husband and I are now a family. So that's a big transition, but I can grieve the fact that we're not still one family. And then changes in roles or identity. If you've worked, had a job, a career for many years, and then you retire, that's a change in your identity. If you move somewhere different, that can be a big change in your life. So think about the changes in your roles or in your identity and how those may be some quiet griefs. I'm having trouble with that word. Let me know in the comments if you know what's the plural of grief. And this stage of life often is layered. There are many transitions, and that just makes grief more complicated. And we can be grieving intangible losses. So the hardest losses can often include safety, predictability, trust, and community stability. And we've touched on all of those. But we can say, so community stability, maybe I'm moving from one town to another. But do we recognize that the loss may be we're grieving the stability that we had in the other community? Maybe if an institution has betrayed us, we're grieving the trust that we once had in that institution that we no longer have. And then predictability, we can be grieving those things too, predictability and safety. But those are just some examples of some of the hardest losses. And we can't hold a funeral for these. These hard losses, these kind of underlying things that we lose, we don't hold a funeral for those, and that makes it even harder. Makes it harder for us to recognize, and it makes it harder for us to process these griefs. Okay, so a common self-doubt that people have when we look at grief and how to deal with the grief, how to process it, is people might think, well, nothing specific happened, so there's no reason for me to be grieving. Or others have it worse. Well, this isn't a comparison. Or we may judge ourselves and say, I should be stronger. Maybe say, isn't that big of a deal? I should be stronger. So these are oftentimes things that we might say, but minimizing grief doesn't resolve it. And also, like I said, grief is not a competition. We can feel our grief and recognize it's there and it's real. And grief lives in our body. It's not just an emotion. It can live inside of our body. And this is one of the first places that the emotion, whatever it is, fear, grief, anger, where that our body is where that emotion comes up. So we may feel a tightness in our shoulders or our chest. I know I really get tight in my shoulders, and right now I am very tight in my shoulders. I need to go get a massage. We can also feel fatigue, or maybe we have changes in our sleep. We can have brain fog, digestive issues, and that can lower our immunity whenever these changes are happening in our body. Our immunity is lowered. And maybe we have tearfulness or numbness. So tearfulness, it's okay to cry, but maybe we're feeling tearful all the time. Maybe we just feel numb a lot. So those can be some things that we might feel in our body. And when you feel those, really pause and think about what is happening. And so a compassionate question, when you feel these things in your body, a compassionate question that you could ask yourself is, what is my body grieving? What is it that my body is grieving right now? And pause and just do that. And then listen to your body. Don't try and think about it in your brain, but really listen. What is my body telling me? Allow your body to speak to you, because it does have the answers. And we need to do this, again, not trying to think about it in our brain, not a logical response, but we want to do this to reduce that self-judgment and to increase curiosity. It's so important to not judge, but to look at it with curiosity. I love thinking about things with curiosity. And then a common worry is if we feel this grief, we won't be able to get over it. It'll be too big, it'll take over our life, so we want to push it down. And again, the body often knows that and can process it before the mind can. But when we push it down, that is not good for us either. At all, not either, at all. We need to feel the grief and the pain to process it. And then an important distinction when we worry that the grief is going to take over is that honoring grief doesn't mean that we're going to drown in the grief. Okay, we can honor it without letting it take over our lives. And this distinction helps us to create emotional safety. I shared earlier that journaling that I did, and I was feeling pretty unhappy, pretty sad at the beginning of that journaling. But then at the end, I felt calmer. That grief, that sadness had softened because I'd brought it up, because I'd communicated it through journaling. Okay, and so what does honoring grief look like? Well, again, allowing those tears without shame, without self-judgment, naming the losses honestly, and I did some of that in my journaling this morning, and gentle attention to those feelings. So what are we feeling, and how can we process that? How can we take care of ourselves? Moving forward at a compassionate pace, knowing we don't need to rush getting over this feeling. We just need to sit with it. We need to be compassionate with ourselves and honor this feeling. And when grief overwhelms, so we can feel like we're drowning in the grief. And what happens when we don't acknowledge it, when we don't feel it and don't process it, we can be drowning in the grief. So what does that look like? Well, we might isolate. We might stay away from other people, stay in our house and just isolate. We may have a lack of routine. And when we feel grief and sadness, that can create depression. And then we may just stay in bed or watch a lot of TV. That can be kind of a depressive way that we deal with things. And as we get older, it's easy to lose our routine, because if you're retired, you don't have a job to go to every day. If you don't have kids in the house, kids create a natural structure and routine. And when we lose that routine, it's easier to just isolate. When we're drowning in grief, we may feel very overwhelmed. So that's another thing to notice when we're feeling overwhelmed. And that's what I did this morning because I realized I was feeling pretty overwhelmed. Just to stop and say, what am I feeling right now? Why do I feel so overwhelmed, and what can I do about it? And not to do that with harsh judgment, but with self-compassion and self-respect. And with grief work, the goal of it is not to eliminate the sadness, but to make it survivable. And you can do that. And ways that we can do it, we can do some journaling like I did, like I shared with you. We can have quiet reflection, what do I need right now? Why am I feeling sadness? Why am I feeling overwhelmed? Reflecting on that. Maybe you want to listen to some music. That just affects our brain in a different way. I had a counselor tell me one time that we can't be listening to music or singing specifically, I think she said. We can't be singing and feeling sadness and grief at the same time. So maybe that's true for you, maybe not. But music does affect our brain in a different way. And so listening to music can help us work with the sadness. We can have different rituals, maybe light a candle as you journal, or light a candle to recognize that sadness and grief can feel dark, can feel like a dark place in our life. But there is light, and the candle shows us the light, shows us that there is light in the world. Or go for a walk. Any type of exercise is good. Maybe go for a reflective walk. And reflective is you look outside, you look in nature. There's so much goodness in nature. And that can help us as we process the grief too. Okay, so a gentle companion with sadness is to shift from fighting sadness to accompanying it. And that's all, that's a lot of what we're talking about here. Examples of companioning with the sadness, with the grief, is kind self-talk. Hand over your heart, allowing tears. We've been talking about these things throughout this video. Reaching for safety, reaching out to trusted people and talking to them, sharing with them how you're feeling. That's so important. And holding gratitude and grief together, recognizing, yes, there is loss, but there was also goodness in this. And so we can recognize the goodness, and we can also recognize the sadness. There's grieving going on about this issue. So an example of that would be maybe you retired from a job that you loved, and you're sad about retiring and moving on. That's another thing that people are like, oh, great, you get to retire. How wonderful, you're free. But there's a real sadness in retiring too, because you've lost a part of you, an identity that you have. But you can recognize those good things about the career you had and still grieve that you've lost it. That's okay too, to hold those two things together. That helps us manage grief better. And like we've talked about too throughout this video, just witnessing it. It doesn't need fixing. Like I shared in my journal, we don't need to fix it. Sometimes we just need to witness it. We just need to sit with the grief and sadness and see what it's trying to tell us, what it's trying to show us. And having grief, having sadness does not mean that you are weak or you're negative or you're broken. Those are all shaming, self-judgmental things. And if you take anything away from this video, I want you to take that you do not need to feel ashamed if you are grieving anything, even if it feels very small. Don't shame yourself. When we grieve, it means that we are human, that we're responsive and we are aware. So being responsive and aware means we look at the grief and we say, okay, what is there? Why am I feeling this? Okay. And acknowledging grief is an act of self-respect. Again, caring for ourselves. So instead of saying, how do I stop feeling sad? What we can say is, how can I hold this grief with care? And when we handle grief with care, it does not harden us. It does not overtake our lives. The reality is, when we notice the grief, when we are calm, when we are gentle on ourselves, when we don't shame ourselves for having it, it really deepens us. We can learn from it. So I hope this helps you as you are maybe feeling some grief today, how to work with that grief, how to recognize and acknowledge it, and how to learn from it and let it deepen you. All right, thank you so much for joining me today. Somewhere here, the other video that I had on anger is going to show up. And if you like this video, please subscribe to my channel, maybe share it with someone else that might need it. All right, thanks so much for being here today. Bye-bye.